I think notions of normal, I think why I find them so problematic is because they seem to reinforce hierarchy. They seem to reinforce inequality. They seem to reinforce, I don't know, a sense of order in a world that isn't ordered.
Hello and welcome to Idioms of Normality. I'm your host, Dr. Mason. This is on Future Framed TV, the podcast series of Traces.Dreams. And I'm joined today by Lucas Mari. Welcome. Thanks for coming on board.
Oh, thanks, Paul. How are you?
Coming into the fold.
Yeah, cheers for having me.
I'm feeling very opportunistic because I get to ask you what is normal. But before I jump in with that question, what perspectives and experiences do you bring to the question of normality?
Yeah, I guess my own research has been in social cultural anthropology, focusing mainly on dances, on people's bodies, on performances, on hip hop dances specifically. I've written a bit about breakers in Western Australia, or graffiti artists and break dancers in Japan or the US. And so I guess I bring that perspective. I think I also bring the perspective of my own person, someone who, is a person of color who grew up in Perth, who, has, a mum that was born in Singapore, an Indian Malay mother and an English dad. I think, we all bring our sort of persons and our own kind of positions and perspectives to, I don't know, wrestling with this sort of concept of normality or normal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I bring that research of hip hop and dances and bodies and that sort of cultural, social perspective. But yeah, that's also clouded by my own positions and experiences as a person in the world, I guess.
And for people outside of Australia, we should put that in context that Perth is a very, very white part of Australia in many ways. And anything non-white is sort of partitioned or put off into, it's very, particularly in the time you were growing up, it's becoming increasingly more multicultural. But
I've only moved to Melbourne in the last year, and already it feels like a much more multicultural. I guess city like Sydney or I guess Brisbane, or I don't really know about the other states, but yeah, Perth is definitely a bit isolated from the other states. It's not like the most popular, I guess, travel spot for a lot of foreigners who coming into Australia. But saying that, yeah, I think it has changed a lot. I think you've got a lot of you've got a lot of people from Southeast Asia who are moving over there. We had a big mining boom about 10 years ago, and that brought a lot of different people into the States. So yeah, things are changing there, I think, for the better. So yeah.
What I love about bringing you into the interview today is that you're not just an academic who writes and reads. You're someone who gets out there and dances hip hop. And I'm not going to say anything about graffiti, but you're also mountain climbing as well, which is great. So I'm just going to jump in with the question: what is normal?
What is normal? I think normal is, I guess I see it as a concept that's used to sort of judge like social acts, social practices. It's used to sort of make judgments about people and about our social and cultural reality. I guess I see the word being kind of useful in some realms. Like, I guess in psychology or in biology, I can see it being this really, really useful concept. It's you can look at what's normal in a big like data set and go, oh, these are sort of common practices amongst a lot of people that we've interviewed, or a lot of the data that we've got. And then here are the abnormal kind of, outliers or bits of data. And so I see it as this really useful concept in some contexts, and then this really problematic and maybe not very useful concept in other in other contexts. And I'm thinking of my own experience, like with anthropology. I feel like normal can be used to like reinforce inequalities. It can be used to reinforce sort of the status quo, like as a way to make a judgment on something that they see as not natural or not ideal, or all these other sort of positivist sort of approaches to like good and bad, which in the social cultural and sciences are a bit problematic. So I guess I see the term normal being a useful way to make sense of the world, but also particularly when we're talking about things of a social cultural nature, I see it as a bit of a problematic way to make sense of it.
So normality is a value judgment, and it has application in some contexts, and you gave the example of, say, experimental psychology and maybe biological sciences, but in social contexts, in everyday usage, perhaps possibly a harmful concept.
Yeah, I think so, because I guess the obvious examples that are coming to me are, when we think about, I think about 50 years ago and we think, oh, what's a normal way to organize our families? What's a normal family structure? What's normal ethnic identity? What's normal for gender? We think of these sorts of concepts of being a way to make sense of those things, but I see them as being kind of problematic in that way, because is there a normal way to organize our families? Is there a normal way to have what's a normal political system? These things can sort of I don't know, I think they reveal our own perspectives and our own assumptions about the world, rather than looking at the differences or the different ways that other people are organizing their political systems, their families, making sense of their own identities in ways that maybe we're not aware of, or our limited understanding of the world is sort of, I don't know, revealed by claiming that something is normal or claiming that something is abnormal. I mean, is it only abnormal because we don't know about it, or there's not enough data, or that it's not like there isn't enough light shed on maybe different ways of understanding race, gender, sex, those sorts of things. So, as our notions, or I think COVID's a good example of that. People are talking so much in the news about the new normal of COVID, but is it the new normal? Like, has it just shifted very quickly for us and it's become a way of making sense of what's going on today? Or are there other people dealing with similar sorts of issues in different parts of the world, and for them this isn't that abnormal? So I guess I see it problematic in that way, because it's often, I think, coming from someone's own assumptions or perspective of the world, rather than a kind of not saying that you can have every perspective understood or made aware of, but I feel like normal is this judgment on someone, or this judgment on something, rather than yeah.
There's two undercurrents to what you said there that intrigue me. One is that normality is a part of sense making. Yes. That reveals biases, that reveals our own personal inclinations or our culturally biased inclinations, and in that sense, normality is also about world making.
Yeah,
it's about imposing certain standards and practices upon our expectations of others. And it's interesting when you said, what is a normal family 50 years ago? It really made me think, actually, normality is something that arose in a rapidly increasingly globalized world, because it's something that, as family structures have been disrupted, as accepted social traditions have been changing and become more porous and had more permeability with in the interface of multiple cultures colliding and interweaving, normality was this sort of this structure that gave people certainty.
Yes.
And it wasn't necessarily something that existed in the world naturally, but it's something that the people in power and the people with the cultural sway to dictate what goes on were able to impose upon others. The two undercurrents there make it interesting for me, because sometimes we use the word normal, but often we are imposing our expectations of normality without even using the word.
Yeah.
And that intrigues me as well.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying, because I feel a bit conflicted, because I do like the concept as a way to say, as an interview technique. Like, if you talk, like you said, talking about how people are imposing their sense of their social cultural reality onto a situation or say a phenomenon, we can use it to say, oh, why do you think, like, what's normal to you in this context? And they can reveal something about themselves or about their social cultural world or about something else that we can interrogate. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's useful in this way because they understand the concept as this like shared kind of, I don't know, a shared kind of tool that we can wrestle with together with people. But then it's also problematic if you were trying to jump from that into saying something broader about a social group. Like, oh, it's normal for all people in Australia to X, Y, and Z, or to, I think to run with this concept as being broad, bigger than, I don't know. It kind of reminds me of cultural relativism. It had that kind of spark in its heyday of being like, wow, this is such a useful tool to understand different cultures, organize, understand, do things differently. And it's hard to make value judgments on what's better or worse. But then, to kind of run with that and make some sort of broader claim of, oh, well, we shouldn't, we can't make, I don't know, negative judgments on another culture based because it's all culturally relative. I think it gets into this I don't know, tricky sort of space where we're trying to organize the world in a sort of a positivist, subjective sort of a way. Instead of seeing the messiness of the world, I guess is what I'm saying.
I want to slow down some of what you said and break some of that first part down, because you're talking about the participant observation research methods of anthropologists, which is to go into other environments and, in a way, study our own abnormality in foreign social environments. Yep. Like, if you go to another cultural milieu and what you do socially, the way you eat, the way you go to the bathroom, the way in which you interrupt a conversation, the way in which you say hi, there are things that you will do that will be abnormal to the local population. Yeah. And when people reveal your abnormality to you, you understand something about their social norms.
Definitely. I love that. And it's something that I used to teach in first year anthro at Curtin, which was to tell students, next time you go order a coffee, try to start breaking the rules, and you'll very quickly see what's normal and what isn't within the social world. Next time you go to buy a coffee, just don't pay for it and see what happens. Do you know what I mean? There are rules, there are normal like ways in which to move through the world, and if you start breaking them, you'll be very quickly made aware of what they are. And I think it works in that context too. Yeah, going into a different space, you might not know that you're breaking a sort of social norm, but you'll be very quickly made aware sometimes. Or it has that kind of feel effect to it, the normal,
So you're now living in what I consider the coffee capital of the world. I have never had better coffee than when I've been in Melbourne. And have you broken those norms in ordering your coffee? Have you run away with your soy chai latte?
No, I definitely haven't. But sometimes when things are very orderly like I say, a coffee shop's a good example. When everyone is knowing, they're getting out their card before they even are told to pay, like they know where to tap. It just makes me think, wow, that people are very good, at like rules and like, working out how to do it and making it seamless. It kind of, from an outsider, if you didn't know what was going on, it was just like, how do these people know, like, to stand here and to line up here and to go pick it up there? There aren't signs anywhere. They know to tap their card. Like, there's sort of all this implicit sort of tacit knowledge that they're learning. And I think it brings into questions of normality if someone like doesn't know those normal tacit rules and knowledge. And these are culturally learned, they're socially learned, they're learned over time. I often think of that, like, not playing dumb, but asking, what's the next thing to do? I think people would be astounded that you didn't know those rules and norms. And I think the concept of normal is useful there. It's a useful way to interrogate different practices, ones that are built over time, ones that are socially and culturally learned. And so, I kind of have this conflicting relationship thinking of the concept, because I think it is useful. It is a productive way to make sense of the world, but it's got all these this history wrapped up in positivism that I just like want to move away from. So yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure what you think about that, but yeah.
No, I want to throw you a curveball and say I don't think it is a useful way of thinking about the world. I think it's a cheap way.
Yeah.
I'm interested in our difference of opinion here because here I'm playing the ball, not the man. But I think normality, when it is used, is kind of a cheap way to not really go a bit further.
Yeah.
You're someone who's ready to break the rules a bit, to break the social rules a bit, to study them, to understand them, to pull them apart. And that's what a tinkerer does. Like a tinkerer will pull apart a clock and put it back together again. And I can see you doing this in coffee lines. Like you're watching people with their credit cards, you're watching people around you, and I kind of wonder if that comes a bit from your spirit of being a breaker, being a
Definitely.
Are you
I definitely
breaking
think
social
so.
rules there? Are you
Breaking or hip hop's history? It came from young African American, Caribbean, like Latino people in New York. Looking at martial arts, looking at ballet, looking at gymnastics, and going, I'm just gonna take and steal and reimagine those things to the music that my parents listened to, which is like soul and funk and jazz and disco, and put it all into this space, and it sort of emerges as this kind of own world. But it's a messy world, and it's a world that doesn't have clear rules, and it doesn't have clear ways of doing it. And something that's really celebrated in hip hop is innovation, is change, is like surprising someone. So I think at breaking like gatherings and events, people are often trying to up one another with being abnormal, with being like really different. Like that if you're starting to conform and do the same thing that everyone else is doing, it's sort of like, I don't know, it's fine, but it's like, what are you bringing to the table? I want to see something random. I want to see something different. I want to see you surprise me. These are the words that breakers often say to one another, what they're trying to do. They're trying to think outside the box constantly to surprise and shock and
how do you
humiliate.
do that? How do you go
Yes.
about that? Because I think there's a way of doing. There's something you learn in dance.
Yeah.
So you learn the rules, so you learn how to break them, and
Yeah.
there's a method of. I think I deep down really believe that dancers really search for freedom of expression, and I've certainly felt that. I might be imposing that upon all.
What if there are no rules? Like breaking doesn't have very clear rules. Like there aren't. We used to make fun of this. We used to, there's some people used to, in a breakdancing competition or battle, they would bring in props. Like some guy brought in nunchucks once and just started like just playing with his nunchucks in a dance battle, and everyone was like, what is this? Is this still breakdancing right now, or is this someone, you know what I mean? Like, what is the level that you can push it to? Like, can you start doing push-ups? Like, I don't, and I think people are going to judge those actions, however they're going to judge them. But at the end of the day, in breaking particularly, there isn't a clear foundation. There is aesthetics that people like and don't like, and people will claim is, part of breaking and not part of breaking. This game constantly is played. Like, what is authentically hip hop and what isn't? This is an age-old question that breaking is constantly wrestling with, and it's wrestling with it a lot now with the Olympics. But I think there's also this undercurrent of always trying to surprise and innovate and change and evolve the dance. And I think because of that, maybe there is this sort of history of like pushing against, I don't know, homogenization, pushing against order, pushing against all those things that normal kind of represents. Competitions have become a bit more mainstream. There's a lot more money to be won. And you're seeing more like athletes, like more gymnasts and ballet dancers and stuff come into the dance, and they're bringing they're bringing that sort of approach into breaking. And some breakers love it because it's like changing the dance, it's making it more fluid, and people are much more flexible and strong, and there's a different sort of acrobatic element to the dance today than there's ever been. But some people aren't liking it because it's moving so far away from breaking in the late 70s, early 80s. And the question arises, what is breaking essentially? If and I think it brings into question again what's normal in breaking, or what should be normal. People are sort of fighting over ownership of these sorts of questions. So
I'm sort of left wondering, is it possible to have like a performance art? Performance art, you can word genre, whatever you want to call it. I wonder if it's possible to have that genre without that question, without asking what is normal for break. I mean, and it's interesting that you bring up the example of the Olympics, because the Olympics and the judging and the way in which you pit one breaker against another breaker.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's so bizarre to have a competition where you take one artist and their art and you rank it against another artist and their art. Ranking art is just, but it does something to art, and that is it creates rules, it creates standards, it creates metrics. It says we're going to put numbers to things that previously it just doesn't make sense to translate a bodily experience and a bodily expression into a number. And I think that's where I find the concept of normality so jarring. In that it tries to quantify things which are inherently qualitative.
Yes. And this is the struggle that a lot of dancers are having, because you're exactly right. There are all these rubrics coming into breaking because of the World Dance Sport Federation, who are running the breaking in the Olympics, have to create a very transparent, a very objective rubric that not just for the judges to make their calls on, but so that the crowd understand, oh, this person beat this person and you know why. You know what I mean? Like before, breaking has often been judged by, there'll be like 3 or 5 judges, an uneven amount usually. And they'll just at the end, like 2 dancers will go in and they'll do their thing, they'll dance. And then the host will go, okay, judges, 3, 2, 1. And the judges will just point to who they think won. And if you ask the judges, oh, why did you point to that guy? They'll make a story up. Oh, I just liked his style. You know, his movement was really cool. I just liked it more than that guy. Or, you know, he executed his moves really well. There's no rubric. People are just making, you know, as they would make assumptions on art in an art gallery. They bring in their own perspectives and their own opinions and aesthetic value judgments, and they make a decision. And I love that about breaking. I love that, you know, people just have their own opinions and they just love the art in different ways, and it makes it quite a diverse art. But the Olympics is going to change that. It's going to have, these like you said, it's going to bring this sort of quantitative approach to try to make sense and try to, I don't know, try to say like this dancer is better because they hit, you know, all these elements in the rubric better than this person did. Just like gymnastics routines have done that for years. It's an art, or is it, I don't know, an art with all these rubrics behind it? It's a hard question.
When we think about the history of ranking, where did the history of ranking come from? It's a very imperialistic,
very
Eurocentric pursuit. You know, the ranking of, you know, previously the ranking of animals, for example, in the animal kingdom, what was in Europe was considered the standard, and anything outside of Europe in the New World was considered degenerate. You know, look at those degenerate livestock over in America, the Americas. Oh, the degenerate beasts they have over there. And they even feared people collapsing into degeneracy when they moved abroad. And so they inherently created this ranking where they favoured their own familiar animal species categories over the unfamiliar, the unknown, the unseen, foreign species and objects and people, and that history of ranking then becomes its own beast. I think ranking in itself has agency. You know, if we be really technical here and apply actor network theory, ranking itself has agency in here, and it's become its own beast. And people who have the time and resources to play into that ranking system can forward their careers better than people who aren't able to manipulate their resources, their family network, their social capital to, you know, reverse engineer the ranking system to their favour.
And we can see that with the history of, say, biological race. You know, there's a story being told about which races are better or worse based on how civilized they are, you know, or how much they, you know, this, you know, we see the same history with this ranking. And I think notions of normal, I think why I find them so problematic is because they seem to reinforce hierarchy. They seem to reinforce inequality. They seem to reinforce, I don't know, a sense of order in a world that isn't ordered. And again, it goes back to exactly what you're saying. Who gets to decide what sits on top, what sits on the bottom? To bring it back to breaking, who gets to decide what gets to be part of the rubric and what doesn't? And how are those sort of judgments assessed by the people who, I don't know, are involved in the dance? In the same way that we can call out racism for, why did these people get to be in charge of, these categories and what they mean and where they sit within the world? And how do these categories keep getting reinforced? How do these stereotypes keep existing? And it's because, it's normal. It's a normal way of understanding. No, it's not. There's a history behind it. There's someone perpetuating these stereotypes. And so, yeah, it has this really, I don't know, this edge to it, I think, that we need to move away from, I think. Yeah.
It scares me how much these ranking systems centered around this false concept of normality spread across cultural divides. So yes. People, it's funny because often you'll see some people or different communities will perhaps be in conflict with each other, and yet this very colonial idea of normality has been adopted, even though they didn't necessarily like the culture of the colonialists. And yet normality has been translated, and the word normality has been adopted by so many different languages around the world.
Yeah.
As the word normal. It's just been poached from the Franco-German that it came from, and it gets a life of its own. People. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating that people so easily understand the concept of normality when it is so arbitrary. It's epistemologically flawed. So that the way in which this concept is constructed is actually not a natural concept. It's a flawed concept, even if you look at it mathematically, because if you apply the average to human populations, it actually doesn't make sense. It's a calculation that was made for single moving objects, not for populations of individuals with each their own developmental trajectories. And yet somehow people adopt it and it makes sense. It's like, normal. Boom. That makes sense.
Why do you think that is? And is there something you were saying? There's a sort of Western colonial sort of history to this word, and I kind of feel it's the same with a lot of other sort of Western kind of ways of thinking or Western knowledges that have been sort of imposed onto other cultures, whether it's through some religious effort in some countries or some other colonial kind of imposition in another country. This concept, as well as many other Western ways of understanding the world, are they do become, like you said, get a life of its own, and they get adopted and reimagined by a local culture. Why is this the case? Like, why do you think this?
Look, I've got a really crude metaphor that comes to mind, but it's just like this invasive species. It's like an invasive concept that sort of swamps. Once it gets in the brain, it just sort of seems to filter and just. I just sort of have an image of the Matrix. It just changes the whole code. As soon as you put this idea of normality in someone's head, it changes the whole code of thinking, and suddenly it has its own gravity, and every other thing that we think about suddenly oscillates around normality and our desires for our own normality or our expectations of other people's normality, perhaps even an awareness of how we are abnormal and how we need to conceal that. And oh my gosh, I don't want anyone to see that I'm abnormal. And this is the fun thing about being an anthropologist, is that we're probably a bit more comfortable being abnormal than the average person.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we're trained to sit with that discomfort.
Right. Yeah, definitely trained to sit with it, trained to kind of see abnormality in the normal, in ourselves and in others. Maybe that's something that part of that training does, that maybe helps us deal with these sorts of questions. Two things that come to mind when you were saying that is a sort of, I think there's like an undercurrent of power here that perhaps we're not mentioning. You know what I mean? Like, power reinforces itself, right? And of course, concepts like this are going to help that. And I think ones that help it more than others sort of survive and perpetuate. And I think this concept is really useful because even on face value, it doesn't seem like this. It is providing, like you said, this dichotomy of like good and evil, or good and bad, or normal, abnormal, natural, not natural, ideal, not ideal. It always works in this kind of this binary. And I think binaries are really strong, as in the same way that you said earlier, the really simple ways of cutting through a really complex world that's messy and trying to make sense of it. So it feels like it's got this two-pronged approach, one being really simplistic and one reinforcing like power dynamics that, help reinforce the status quo, I guess. Yeah.
I'm super fascinated. I mean, I could be chatting with you all day, but what questions do you think we should be asking about normality?
I think we should be more critical of where it's not useful and try to erase that sort of binary. I mean, I feel like anthropology has been doing this is like a project that's been going on since the 40s or 50s. It's to look at terms like normal and see it for what it is, see its positivist kind of history and approach in psychology and other kinds of fields, see that the way it reinforces like the same kind of power dynamics, see in the way that it has this kind of, I don't know, this function to make sense of the world that's too simplistic, too easy, too too black and white. And to see it in some contexts as being, okay, maybe it's useful in this way and not useful in this way. I think we need to be clearer of where it isn't useful and try to maybe find other terms or other ways of making sense of the world that is maybe not as easy, but makes more sense, or at least allows for different possibilities and different, I don't know, ways to make sense of what we would usually use normal for. I guess, I don't know. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded as an answer. But I guess just being more critical of where it's useful and where it's not. Because I think it does have use, as particularly in the, like you said, as an ethnographic method for talking with people. But it can be useful as a way also to be critical of it and critical of the dynamic that it presents.
Yeah, one of the easiest ways I find is as soon as you hear the word normal or normality, that for me is always a moment where like I can't help it now. It's just like this jerk reaction where I'm like, oh, hang on, jerk reflex, what do they call it? Yeah, and I go, oh, that's interesting. Why'd they use the word normal there? What are they reinforcing?
Yes.
Why are they subscribing to that concept, and why are they asking others to subscribe to it in that moment? But if the word normal wasn't there, I would have less of a chance to identify a system that needs to be critiqued.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
So I'm grateful that the word normal is there because it gives me something it's the pause button for me. It's the pause button in my brain. But I'm also not grateful for it to be there. Like I wish thinking wasn't gravitating around what can be very harmful concept, not just harmful socially, but harmfully personally and emotionally. And I agree with you totally that we need to be more critical of the moments where normality is not a useful concept.
Yep. And I agree. Maybe, and this has happened a lot within the social cultural sciences, I think, is where we go, oh, we shouldn't use this word. It's so positivist. It's so, such a sharp way to make sense of, this sort of phenomenon. The old structure and agency fight, people seem to go, okay, yeah, there's a problem here. This word, this term is not helpful. And then we use a different term. And it's sort of like, it's not always using different terms. It's a way of reimagining the whole thing quite differently and reimagining the social world a little differently. And to look at things like you said, who are the people, what assumptions are being made? Like, because people are still going to make assumptions. People are going to talk about COVID and the new world that we're in and talk about the new normal, and they're going to have different ways of making sense of it. And what's in there is a sense of like, well, this is how it is now, and you better get like used to it, and you better, adapt to these new practices and this new way of being. There is always those assumptions going to be made, whether it's used with the word normal or something else. So yeah, I feel like it's an ongoing project that is bigger than just a change of term. But I think we have the same feelings about all those sorts of those terms that try to do the same thing, I guess.
Lucas, thank you so much for joining us on Idioms of Normality. It's been great having you on the show.
Yeah, I could have talked to you for hours about this. Really great to meet you and really great to chat about this.
I hope that we do get to meet in person, that we get to break the social rules at a coffee line, and then you can
see what happens.
Some breaking.
Yeah,
you can teach me some breaking, and I'll whip out the nunchucks.
Awesome! We've got to do it. Yeah.
Someone will get hurt if I have nunchucks in my hand, so I better stick to something less harmful.
Well, we've got to do it. Yeah, definitely.
And make sure, I always forget to do this, but I'm getting better at it. I need to let people to know that they should like, share, subscribe, They should share this footage of Lucas Murray speaking to me about what is normal as far and wide as they can. And thank you so much to our listeners, and thank you to Lucas Murray.
Thanks, Paul. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.